Part 1. The last vote. The vote was already over when I stood up. 387 green lights glowed across the chamber display. One red light. Hours. I did not need to count them. I had been counting them for the past 6 weeks, one by one, as each delegation quietly shifted its position away from us. By the time the session opened this morning, I already knew the number. I had known it for 3 days. I came anyway. I have been Ms. Dara Osi. I have been Earth's ambassador to the Galactic Accord for 11 years. In that time, I have sat through 412 sessions, signed 29 trade agreements, argued 17 border disputes, and once spent 9 hours in a back corridor convincing a Velhari elder not to leave the Accord entirely over a fishing rights disagreement that had nothing to do with fish and everything to do with pride. I have eaten food that tasted like warm metal. I have breathed air that smelled like old copper pipes. I have smiled at species whose facial structures made smiling biologically impossible. And I have done it every single time because that is the job. Today, the job was something different. The Grand Accord chambers on Veth Prime are built to impress. Everything here is built to impress. The ceiling rises 400 meters above the floor, its inner surface lined with bioluminescent panels that shift color based on the emotional consensus of the room. Right now, they were a calm, satisfied blue. The chamber holds delegations from 402 species, each seated on a platform calibrated to their home gravity, atmosphere, and light preferences. Translation matrices run on 17 parallel channels. The whole structure was built 6,000 years ago, back when humanity was still drawing animals on cave walls, and it has not changed much since. That is, I think, the point. This place says, we were here before you. We will be here after you. Sit down and accept that. I have never found it particularly intimidating. Maybe that is a human problem. The Kirathi delegate, Preetor Sivith, sat at the head of the session table. The Kirathi looked like something between a spider and a diplomat, which I have always found fitting. 8 limbs, 4 of which are used for locomotion, 4 for gesture. Their faces are wide and flat, with compound eyes that catch every light in the room at once. Sivith had been lobbying for Resolution 7 Omega for 3 years. He had done it carefully, quietly, methodically. He had called in old favors, he had offered new ones. He had framed humanity not as an enemy, but as a problem. The way you might describe a leaking pipe. Not malicious, just in need of correction. The resolution was elegant in its cruelty. Earth's colonial territories, the 17 stations and 4 settled worlds humanity had established over the past century, would be redistributed under Accord administration. Earth itself would retain observer status in the Accord, a polite way of saying we could watch but not speak. All human military vessels beyond our home system would be escorted out. All human contracts in the outer sectors would be reviewed and reassigned. The language was careful. Words like restructuring and rebalancing and administrative efficiency appeared everywhere. The word exile did not appear once. It did not need to. Sivith looked at me across the chamber. Even from this distance, across 200 meters of open floor and 400 sets of alien eyes, I could see the satisfaction in his posture. The Kirathi communicate a great deal through the angle of their upper limbs, and his were held at exactly the position that, in their culture, means this is already finished. He was right. It was finished. The vote was done. The session moderator, a soft-spoken Orion named Velith, spoke into the chamber. Her voice carried through the translation matrix in that particular flat tone they always used for formal proceedings. The Accord has voted on Resolution 7 Omega. The result stands at 387 in favor, 1 opposed. The resolution passes. Ambassador Osi, the Accord recognizes Earth's position as the sole dissenting voice. Does Earth accept the Council's decision? I looked at Velith. I looked at Sivith. I looked slowly around the room at 400 delegations sitting in their gravity-adjusted seats, watching me with whatever expression their biology allowed. Some were curious, some were relieved. A few I noticed were not looking at me at all, which told me more than the ones who were. I gathered my notes. I closed the folder. I set my pen down on the table. Then I did something I had never done in 11 years of diplomacy. I said nothing. I stood up, pushed my chair back, and I walked toward the exit. My footsteps on the chamber floor were the only sound in the room. The translation matrix had gone quiet. No one was speaking. 400 species, representing collectively more than 6,000 years of interstellar civilization, sat completely still and watched a single human being walk out of the room. I did not look back. I stepped through the exit corridor, past the Kirathi security detail who moved aside without being asked, past the row of press drones that had been hovering near the chamber entrance, past the small crowd of junior delegates who had gathered to watch the moment. I walked past all of it and kept going until the chamber doors were 50 meters behind me, and I was standing in the open-air corridor that ran along the exterior of the Accord building, looking out at Veth Prime's pale orange sky. My communicator buzzed. It was our mission coordinator back at the Earth Embassy, I answered. Sir, he said, what happened? Resolution passed, I said. 387 to 1. A pause. And you just walked out? Yes. Another pause. What did you say? Before you left, the audio feed cut and we couldn't. Nothing, I said. I didn't say anything. The silence on his end lasted 4 full seconds. I counted them. Sir, he said carefully, every threat assessment system in this building just went active. I watched a cloud move across the orange sky. It was a deep amber color, almost beautiful, if you could forget what the atmosphere was actually made of. I know, I said. Send the recall signal, all staff. We're closing the embassy tonight. I ended the call before he could answer. Behind me, through the thick walls of the Accord chamber, I imagined the room still sitting in silence. I imagined Siveth's upper limbs shifting. I imagined Velith trying to decide whether to formally close the session or wait for something, though no one could have said what that something might be. I imagined 400 species looking at one empty chair and suddenly finding it much more alarming than they had expected. They had spent 3 years building a resolution to remove us. They had not spent a single day thinking about what happens if we simply agreed to go. I stood there a moment longer, breathing air that tasted like copper, and then I turned and walked away from the grandest political building in the known galaxy, feeling for the first time in a very long while, perfectly calm. Part 2. What silence means in our language. I was eating a dry protein meal at my station console when Ambassador Osi's walkout reached us on delay. The feed was 6 hours old by the time it arrived on the Endurance. That is what distance does to information out here. It ages it, makes it feel almost historical even when the wound is fresh. I watched the footage twice. I watched Osi stand up, close her folder, set down her pen, and walk out of that chamber without a word. I watched the room sit completely still. I watched the door close behind her. Then I switched off the display and sat in the quiet for a while. My name is Admiral Nora Callum. I command the 1st Human Expedition Fleet, which currently consists of 14 warships, 6 supply carriers, 2 hospital vessels, and a mobile repair station, all sitting in a loose formation about 60,000 kilometers off the outer edge of the Tanith relay system. We have been here for 7 months, technically on a survey mission, technically in international space, technically doing nothing that violates any Accord treaty. Those 3 uses of the word technically tell you everything you need to know about the position we were already in before today. I have been in space for 31 years. I was born on Earth, in a city that floods twice a year because of sea level changes. We stopped trying to reverse sometime before my parents were born, and I joined the fleet at 19 because it was either that or a water reclamation crew. And at 19, I was too impatient to spend my life moving water uphill. I worked my way through every rank, every posting, every type of vessel. I have commanded surveying ships, freight escorts, search and rescue teams, and eventually warships. I have met representatives of 40 species in person, face-to-face, in settings ranging from formal diplomatic chambers to emergency life support modules. I have shaken hands, or their equivalents, with beings whose entire lifespan is shorter than my career. And I can tell you, with the certainty of 3 decades of experience, that humanity is not what other species think we are. They think we are impulsive. They point to the way we make decisions quickly, the way we build things faster than we plan them, the way we argue loudly and change our minds and argue again. They find this alarming. What they miss is that impulsive and fast are not the same thing. We are fast because we have always lived in a world that punishes hesitation. Our history is built on the wreckage of moments when someone waited too long. They think we are emotional. They mean it as a flaw. What they do not understand is that emotion is not the opposite of strategy. Emotion is fuel. It is what makes a human engineer work 36 hours without rest to solve a problem that a more rational species might have classified as unsolvable and logged for future review. And they think we are young. They are right about that one, technically. But young does not mean weak. Sometimes it means desperate. And desperate, in my experience, is one of the most dangerous things in any galaxy. I thought about all of this as I waited for my orders to arrive. They came 3 hours after the footage did. They were not what I expected, not attack orders, not emergency defense protocols, not even a readiness alert. What arrived in my command queue was a set of instructions so quiet and so precise that I read them 3 times before I was sure I understood them correctly. First, recall all embedded human advisors from Accord-adjacent stations and relay posts. There were 412 of them across 22 locations. They were to return to fleet within 48 hours. Second, stand down the 2 hospital vessels from their current humanitarian assignment in the Signy border zone. The 7,000 patients they were currently treating were to be transferred to Accord medical facilities. Our ships were to leave the area. Third, dark all diplomatic channels. No outgoing communications on Accord frequencies. No responses to incoming hails from non-human vessels, not even automated status signals. Fourth, the mobile repair station, which had been quietly maintaining the Tanith Relay Network's Eastern Junction for the past 2 years, was to suspend all repair activity and begin withdrawal. There was no dramatic declaration, no ultimatum, no list of demands, no deadline. Just those 4 items, written in plain operational language, delivered through our standard secure channel. I read them a 4th time. Then I put down the document and called my senior staff to the briefing room. I remember the look on Lieutenant Orion Bates's face when I finished reading the orders aloud. Orion is 29, bright, and very good at making quick calculations in his head. He sat there for a moment, working through something, and then his expression changed in a way I recognized. It was the expression of someone who has just added a column of numbers, and gotten a total that seems too large to be real, but checks out every time they add it again. The Tanith Eastern Junction, he said slowly. We've been running that ourselves. For 2 years, I said, and the Accord doesn't have backup crews for it. Apparently not. He was quiet for a moment. What about the Signy hospital ships? 17 of the patients are in active surgical recovery, I said. We're transferring them to the nearest Accord medical facility. It's 9 hours away. Which facility? The Vilhari General Outpost on Station 4. A longer silence. Commander Petralang, my executive officer, was doing the same quiet calculation. I watched it move across her face. The Vilhari Outpost doesn't have the equipment for post-surgical intensive care, she said. No, I said. It doesn't. The room was very quiet. We're not going to talk about that, I said. We're going to execute the orders. And we did. I want to be very clear about that. We executed every instruction precisely and without delay. That is what discipline means. It means that you trust the larger plan even when you cannot see all of it, and you do your part cleanly. Over the next 48 hours, I watched the fleet reorganize around me. The hospital ships began their transfer protocols. The embedded advisors started coming in from their postings. The repair station went dark, the diplomatic channels closed, and the Accord noticed. The first hail came from a Karathi patrol vessel about 30 hours in. It was a routine contact, professional, polite. They asked our status. I did not respond. 12 hours later, a Vilhari reconnaissance ship moved into sensor range. They hailed 3 times over 6 hours. I did not respond. Then came the message from the Accord's Joint Communication Bureau, a formal channel request, high priority. I looked at it for a moment then. I flagged it as received and did not reply. I learned later that within 72 hours of our communications going dark, 3 separate intelligence assessments had been filed by 3 different Accord member species. I got to read them eventually. They were remarkably similar to each other. They all began with variations of the same sentence. Humanity has gone silent, and we do not know why. What struck me about those reports was not what they feared we were doing. They feared all the wrong things. Fleet movements, weapons testing, secret alliances with outer sector species. Every scenario they modeled involved us being loud. Every threat they imagined had a sound to it, a signal, a declaration of intent. It never occurred to any of them that the most serious thing we could do was simply stop. On the 31st hour, a small Vilhari scout ship moved to within close hail range and pinged our command channel directly. It was a personal channel, not a diplomatic one. Someone on that ship knew our specific frequencies. I let it sit. Then after a moment, I answered. The voice on the other end was careful, almost delicate. Admiral Callum, we are seeking clarification on your fleet's current status and intentions. We have noted the withdrawal of human support personnel from several key locations. We are concerned. I looked at the speaker for a moment, then I smiled. It was not a friendly smile. Exactly. It was the particular smile of someone who is holding a very large card and has just been asked if they are holding any cards at all. I reached forward and cut the channel. I stood up from my console, walked to the forward observation window, and looked out at the stars. Somewhere behind me, I could feel the fleet settling into its new shape. Quiet, organized, waiting. Whatever came next, we were ready for it. What no one on the outside seemed to understand, what they perhaps could not understand, was that we had not started this by walking out of a chamber. We had started this a long time ago. The walkout was just the moment we let them see it. Part 3, the 30 days the galaxy could not sleep, I wrote Resolution 7 Omega myself. I want to be honest about that. It is easy now to look at what has happened and pretend that the resolution was someone else's idea, that I was merely an instrument of broader Accord concerns. But I am a prater of the Karathi Accord, and we do not survive as long as I have by being instruments. I built that resolution from the first sentence. I chose every word. I spent 3 years in careful, patient conversation with 387 delegations, and I called in favors older than some of those delegations' membership in the Accord. It was my finest political achievement. I believed completely that it was the right thing to do. Humanity had been a disruption since the moment they arrived. Loud, fast, emotionally volatile, constitutionally incapable of accepting the slow rhythms of galactic diplomacy. In 60 years of Accord membership, they had filed more objections, proposed more amendments, and caused more procedural delays than any species in the past 500 years. They were, as I had told the Joint Council more than once, a destabilizing variable. The galaxy had been stable for a very long time. Stability, I believed, was worth protecting. I will now tell you how thoroughly I was wrong. It did not begin with a crisis. It began with small reports, filed by junior analysts, flagged as low priority, sitting in queues that no senior official was checking because the resolution had just passed, and everyone involved in its construction was, in various ways, celebrating. The first report I saw was about food. Specifically, it was about a chain of agricultural platforms in the outer Cygni belt, human-operated, human-maintained, producing a particular variety of protein-dense grain that fed 11% of the Velhari population across 4 systems. The platforms had gone offline, not destroyed, not damaged, simply offline. The human crews had left, taken their equipment, and departed in an orderly fashion within 48 hours of the resolution passing. The Velhari filed a formal complaint. I noted it, moved on. 4 days later, a second report. The Galactic Relay Network's Eastern Junction, which handles about 30% of all long-range communication traffic between the inner and outer sectors, had gone dark. The station that ran it, a human-operated repair post, had been vacated. The Accord's own relay technicians, dispatched to take over, arrived to find everything neatly shut down, equipment logged and cataloged, manuals placed in labeled storage, ready for someone to restart. The problem was that restarting it required a very specific type of calibration expertise that it turned out only the human crew possessed. The Accord's technician stood in the station for 9 hours before filing a report that said, in its careful official language, that the junction could not currently be restored to operation. I read that one more carefully. Then on the 8th day, I received something I did not expect. It was a private communication from Coordinator Vethanai of the Orion Joint Resource Council. Vethanai was not someone who communicated privately. She was a senior figure, formal, precise, institutional in everything she did. The message was 4 sentences long. It said, Preter Sivith, I am reaching out before this becomes an official matter. Our infrastructure review has identified 17 systems in which human-operated facilities were providing services we had not formally cataloged. I am sending you the list. I suggest you read it before your morning session. I read it that night. It took me until the following morning to finish. The list was long. Not dramatically long, it did not feel like a document designed to shock. It was the kind of list that a mid-level administrator produces when they are trying to do an honest accounting of something that no one has honestly accounted for before. Systems and stations and relay nodes and medical outposts and cargo routes and water reclamation facilities and geological survey programs, all of them human-operated, all of them performing functions that the Accord's own infrastructure either did not cover or had quietly stopped covering at some point and allowed humans to fill. I remember the specific moment I understood what I was looking at. It was near page 43 of the document. There was an entry for a small atmospheric processing station on the 3rd moon of the Velhari home system. The station was human-built and human-operated. It processed trace contaminants from the moon's upper atmosphere. The Velhari had a research colony on that moon, about 4,000 researchers, long-term, doing geological work. The station had been running for 22 years. The Velhari's own records classified it as a human commercial enterprise, a private contract, not critical infrastructure. It was not. Without it, the trace contaminant levels in the moon's atmosphere would reach unsafe levels for Velhari respiration within approximately 90 days. The station had been vacated 8 days ago. I sat with that for a long time. The reports kept coming. Every morning, my staff would arrive with new ones, and every morning there would be more entries on the list of things humanity had been doing that we had not thought to track because we had not thought to look. a desalination network on an Orion water world, a deep space weather monitoring array that provided storm path data to 14 different shipping companies across 6 species, a translation archive maintained by a single human linguist team, which held the only working reference documents for 3 extinct languages that 2 living species still used in ceremonial contexts. None of it was dramatic. None of it was the kind of thing that gets discussed in accord sessions or written into treaties. It was all quiet, functional, practical work. The kind of work that does not get noticed until it stops. On the 19th day, I called my senior advisors together and asked them a question I should have asked 3 years ago. I asked them, what do we know about what humanity actually does? The answer, delivered carefully and with obvious discomfort, was, not as much as we thought. What we knew was what was on the formal record. Embassy staff, diplomatic filings, accord-registered trade operations. That was what we had counted when we built the case for the resolution. We had looked at humanity's political footprint and decided it was too large and too disruptive, and we had acted to reduce it. We had not looked at anything else. I began to understand slowly the shape of the mistake. For 60 years, humanity had been in the Accord. In that time, they had been loud and difficult and argumentative at every diplomatic table. We had spent 60 years watching the table. We had not watched what they were doing everywhere else. On the 24th day, 3 Accord member species filed formal emergency petitions citing infrastructure failures linked to human withdrawal. On the 26th day, the Velhari researcher colony on the 3rd moon began a mandatory evacuation due to worsening atmospheric conditions. On the 28th day, the Tanith Relay Network's eastern junction was still offline, and 17 shipping companies had rerouted their entire operations around the dead zone, adding between 60 and 90 days to every freight run that used to take 12. And through all of it, not a single human communication had come through. No threats, no demands, no ultimatums, no declarations of any kind, just silence. On the 30th day, my aide brought me one final item. It was not a report. It was a transmission, received on an old secondary frequency, from Ambassador OC. I had not heard her name since the chamber session. I had not thought much about her since then. She had walked out of the room, and, in my mind, that had been the end of her relevance. The transmission was very short. It contained no words, it contained coordinates. I looked at those coordinates for a long time. I cross-referenced them against our charts. The location was in a region the Accord had surveyed approximately 100 years ago. The survey report classified it as unremarkable, no habitable worlds, no significant resources, no strategic value. We had noted it and moved on. I looked at the coordinates again, then I called my senior navigation officer. Get me a ship, I said, a quiet one. How quiet, Preeter? I thought about it. Small crew, no military markings. The kind of vessel you take when you want to arrive somewhere without making it feel like an event. He asked no further questions, which is one of the things I have always valued about him. I sat alone in my office for a while after that, looking at the coordinates on my display and thinking about the moment, 30 days ago, when I had watched Ambassador OC stand up from her seat in the Grand Accord chambers and walk out without a word, and how I had seen it as a surrender. I had been telling myself that for 30 days. I was no longer sure I believed it. Part 4. What we built while you were watching each other. I was not surprised when Sivith's ship dropped out of transit at the edge of the Veil. I was mildly surprised that he had brought 12 others with him. I was watching on the long-range display from the bridge of the Haven, one of the Veil's civilian coordination vessels. A sturdy ship that looks like what it is, a working ship built for function rather than impression. The fleet of 13 Accord vessels came out of transit in a loose cluster, hesitant the way ships become hesitant when the people inside them are not sure what they are looking at. I watched them adjust their sensors. I watched them run scans. I watched them one by one go very quiet. My name is Dara Osi. I have been telling this story, and so I will keep telling it. What Sivith and his 12 colleagues were looking at, spread out across the 7 inner systems of the Veil, was not what anyone who had read the Accord's survey report would have expected. The survey, conducted 104 years ago by a joint Oran-Karathi team, had described this region in 3 lines. No habitable worlds. No significant mineral resources. No permanent structures detected. Classified as uninhabitable and of no strategic value. Case closed. The survey had been accurate when it was written. At that time, there was nothing here. What the survey could not account for was the following 100 years. Let me describe what they were seeing, because it is worth describing carefully. 17 star systems, not the original 3s the survey covered. The others had been incorporated over time as our reach expanded. 4 fully terraformed worlds, each one a project that had taken between 20 and 40 years of continuous work. Not beautiful, not comfortable in any way that a tourist would recognize, but livable, breathable, capable of supporting crops, livestock, and human populations without external supply chains. Those populations, as of the day Sivith arrived, numbered 41 million people. They had been born here, most of them. They had grown up here, worked here, built here. Some of them had grandparents who had been among the first settlers. They had never attended an accord session. They had never signed an accord treaty. They had never met a praetor. They were, technically, citizens of Earth. Practically, they were something else. A version of humanity that had spent 3 generations solving problems that no one was watching them solve. Spread across the terraformed worlds, and the station networks between them, was an industrial infrastructure that I will try to describe without pride, though. Pride is what I feel when I think about it. Shipyards capable of producing a new corvette every 11 days. Fabrication complexes turning raw ore into finished components at a rate that would have made the Accord's largest industrial stations look modest. Research facilities working on problems that the Accord had classified as low priority or theoretically unresolvable. A medical research center that had been working, quietly, on a treatment for a degenerative neural condition that affected 3 Accord species, because the researchers had read about it in an old diplomatic brief and decided it was worth working on. And underneath all of it, the thing I am most proud of, the thing that took the longest to build, an energy network connecting every station and every planet in the Veil into a single shared grid, designed with redundancies upon redundancies, so that no single failure could bring any part of it down. We had grown up on a planet where the grid went down sometimes. We had decided, collectively and over several generations, that this was a problem worth solving permanently. I watched Sivith's ship maneuver cautiously, toward the first waypoint I had flagged in the coordinates. It was a communications relay, a large one, the kind that could handle the traffic volume of a small sector. I had built it deliberately into the coordinates as the first thing they would see, because a communications relay is not a weapon, and I wanted them to understand that from the beginning. A formal hail came through, not military, not aggressive. Simply a request for communication filed correctly through our outer network's standard protocol, which meant someone on Sivith's ship had actually read the navigation guide we had posted at the edge of the Veil. I took the call personally. His face on the display was not the face I had last seen in the Accord chambers. Sivith was composed always, that is one thing I will say for him. But there was something different in his expression. Something I recognized because I had seen it on human faces before. The expression of someone trying very hard to remain calm while their internal model of the world quietly falls apart. Ambassador Osei, he said. His translation matrix was running, but he had chosen to have it render in Standard Accord Common rather than Karathi, which was itself a subtle signal. He was trying to communicate on neutral ground. Praetor Sivith, I said, a silence. He was looking at something off-screen, almost certainly his sensor displays. This region, he said carefully, was surveyed and classified as uninhabitable. 104 years ago, I said. The survey was accurate at the time. He processed that. How long have you been building here? 91 years, I said. We started about 13 years after the survey closed. Another silence, longer this time. This is not in any Accord registry. No, it isn't. Humanity never disclosed. No. We didn't, I said it plainly, without apology and without aggression. I had thought carefully about the tone of this conversation. I was not here to make him feel small. I was here because something had to change, and the only way to change it was to have an honest conversation about what had actually been happening for the past century, which required first that he understand what he was looking at. I let him look. His colleagues' ships were fanning out slowly across the near systems, their sensors running at full capacity. I had authorized the outer network to provide full scan access. There was nothing here I needed to hide. That was rather the point. 41 million people, he said eventually. His aide had clearly been running the numbers. 41,217,000. As of last month's census, I said. We keep good records. You have military vessels. We have vessels capable of defending this region if it came to that, I said. We have never used them offensively. We have never threatened any Accord member. In 91 years of operation out here, we have not fired a single weapon at a living target. That is not the same as not being a military force. No, I agreed. It isn't. He was quiet for a long time. I let him be quiet. One of the things I have learned in 11 years of diplomacy is that silence is not a vacuum that needs to be filled. Sometimes it is the most important thing you can offer someone, the space to actually think. Ambassador, he said finally, and I noticed that he used the title, which he had not been obligated to do. What is it that you want? I had prepared for this question. I had thought about it for a long time, actually, because the answer that comes naturally to humans in a moment of hard-won advantage is usually not the right answer. It is the answer of the moment, shaped by anger and exhaustion and the particular kind of hurt that comes from being dismissed by people you worked very hard to earn respect from. But I am not at my best a person of the moment. I am at my best a person who thinks about what comes after. I want recognition, I said. Sisivith blinked, all four of his secondary eyes, which was, for a Karathi, the equivalent of a very long pause. Recognition. I want the Accord to formally and permanently acknowledge humanity's contributions to galactic civilization, I said. Every agricultural system we built, every relay we maintained, every patient treated on our hospital ships, every piece of infrastructure we created and maintained and never asked credit for. I want it documented. I want it in the Accord's official history. I want a formal statement ratified by every member species, acknowledging that for 60 years humanity was a load-bearing part of this structure, and that we were treated as a nuisance while we held it up. Sivith said nothing. I also want the resolution overturned, I continued, our territories returned, our Accord status restored to full voting membership, and a new charter provision that requires infrastructure dependency reviews before any expulsion or restriction vote is ever filed again. That is a significant list, he said. Yes, I said, it is. And if the Accord does not agree, I looked at him for a moment. I thought about 41 million people who had built something extraordinary in the quiet, away from anyone who was watching. I thought about 14 warships sitting dark in the Tanith system. I thought about an atmospheric processing station on a Velhari moon that had been offline for 32 days. I thought about a relay network that was still quiet, and all the freight still rerouting around the dead zone, adding 90 days to every shipment. Then we stay quiet, I said simply. We keep our people here, we run our own infrastructure, we stop maintaining yours. And we wait, we are very patient, Praetor Sivith. It is something most species never quite believe about us, but it is true. We can wait a very long time, I watched him think. I will need to consult with the full Accord, he said. Of course, I said. We'll be here. I ended the call and stood at the bridge window, looking out at the Vale's quiet stars, and I let myself feel for just a moment the weight of what had been built in this place. Not by me, not by any one person. By generations of people who had come out here with tools and seeds and plans and the stubborn human conviction that if something needs to exist, you should build it. I thought about my grandmother, who had told me once that the best revenge is building something so good that people cannot afford to ignore it forever. She had said it about something much smaller than this. But the principle, it turns out, scales. Part 5, the new Accord, 1 year. That is how long it took to negotiate. Not because the agreement was complicated, though parts of it were. It took a year because trust, once broken, does not heal on any schedule that is convenient for anyone, and because Sivith had to go back to 400 delegations and explain things that none of them wanted to hear. And some of those delegations pushed back, and some of them pushed back very hard. And every time one of them pushed back, the negotiations slowed, and the lawyers rewrote things, and the translators worked late. And I sat in a temporary office on Velth Prime eating food that still tasted like copper and waited. I am good at waiting, I have mentioned this. But let me tell you about the day the agreement was signed. Because that day matters. The Grand Accord chambers had been changed. Not dramatically. The Karathi do not go in for drama when they can avoid it, but there were changes. The seat configuration had been adjusted. The Earth delegation's platform, which, for 60 years had been positioned at the outer edge of the Eastern Arc, the functional equivalent of the seat near the door that nobody wants, had been moved. It was now central, not prominent, not elevated above others, central in the way that a load-bearing column is central, placed where it needs to be based on the actual structure of things rather than on tradition or preference. I sat at that platform on the morning of the signing and looked out at the room. 387 species who had voted to erase us were now sitting with copies of a document that began with 2 words. I had written those 2 words myself and submitted them as non-negotiable. I had refused to sign anything that did not begin with them. The document began, "We were wrong." I had been warned by 3 different legal advisors that beginning an Accord treaty with an admission of error was unprecedented and potentially destabilizing. I had thanked each of them for their analysis and informed each of them that I did not care. The truth was that I did care very much about what came after those words. But those words themselves were not negotiable. They were the point. The entire exercise of the past year had been leading to those words, and if we could not say them out loud in a document that 400 species would ratify and put in their official archives, then we were not actually changing anything. After the words "we were wrong" came 40 pages of specific, detailed, formal acknowledgement. Every agricultural system, every relay network, every hospital vessel, every maintained station, every piece of infrastructure built and operated by human hands for 60 years, listed by location, by operational period, by the number of people it served. 40 pages of the things we had done that no one had been keeping track of. Below that, the terms of return. Our colonial territories restored, our accord status restored, the resolution struck from the record. The new charter provision requiring infrastructure dependency reviews before any restriction vote could proceed. And at the very bottom, above the signature lines, a permanent memorial clause which required the Accord's official historical archive to maintain a record of this period. Not the version where humanity was a destabilizing variable that needed to be corrected, but the accurate version where humanity was a contributing member that had been taken for granted and nearly lost. I looked at all of it from my platform, and I thought about my grandfather, who had been a civil engineer and who used to say, whenever he finished a project, do good work and put your name on it. Simple advice, harder to follow than it sounds. Sivith was sitting across the chamber. He looked, as I have said before, diminished. But I want to be careful about that word, because diminished does not mean defeated, and it does not mean humiliated, and it does not mean I had won some great contest against him. He looked diminished the way anyone looks when they have spent a year honestly reckoning with a mistake they cannot undo. That is not weakness. That is actually one of the harder things a person can do. I had not expected to feel any particular way about Sivith by the end of this, but I found, sitting across from him on the morning of the signing, that I felt something close to respect. Not for the resolution, never for that, but for the fact that he had come to the Vale himself, with 12 ships, and he had looked at what we built, and he had not tried to find a way to dismiss it, or deny it, or reclassify it. He had sat with it for a year, and then he had gone back to 400 delegations and told them the truth, and that had been, by all accounts, an extremely difficult series of conversations. Truth is difficult when it requires revising something you built. The formal signing took 4 hours. That is the nature of treaties with 400 signatories. Even when the content is agreed, the mechanics of the thing take time. Every delegation sent a representative to the signature floor. Some of them met my eyes as they passed. Some of them did not. A few stopped briefly, not to speak, just to pause, the way people pause when they are trying to communicate something and have not found words for it yet. One of them was the Orion moderator, Velith, who had run the session a year ago. She stopped in front of me for a moment and said very quietly, "I abstained." I had not known that. The abstention record had been sealed as part of the original vote procedure. I looked at her. "I did not vote against you," she said. "I did not vote for you. I told myself that was neutrality." She paused. "I understand now that it was not. I did not know what to say to that, which is unusual for me. So I said the true thing. Thank you for telling me." She nodded and moved on. After the signing, there was a reception. These things always end with a reception. There is something deeply universal about the need to eat small food and make polite conversation after a significant event, regardless of biology. I moved through it slowly, speaking to delegation members, answering questions, accepting the particular form of diplomatic warmth that species deploy when they are trying to rebuild goodwill after a period of conflict. I was patient with it. It was the work. Near the end of the reception, I found a quiet corner near one of the chamber's large exterior windows and stood there for a moment, looking out at Veth Prime's orange sky. Lieutenant Callum, Orion Bates, Admiral Callum's aide, who had come to Veth Prime as part of the delegation support staff, found me there and brought me a cup of something hot that was not quite tea but was trying its best. "How does it feel?" he asked. I thought about that honestly. "Like the beginning of something," I said. "Not like the end." He considered that. "Is that good? It's accurate," I said. "Good remains to be seen." He nodded and stood next to me for a while, looking out at the sky. From where we stood, I could not see the Vale. It was on the other side of the galaxy from here, in a quiet region that would now begin appearing on official Accord charts for the first time. 41 million people were going about their day out there, most of them unaware of exactly what had been signed today, though they knew something was coming. The communication we had sent before I left for Veth Prime had been brief. "We are going back in fully. on our own terms, more to follow. I thought about what more to follow would look like. Humanity had been in the Accord for 60 years, and we had spent most of that time being loud and difficult at diplomatic tables while quietly, practically, doing the actual work of keeping things running in the background. That combination had been, in retrospect, both our greatest strength and our greatest weakness. The work had given us leverage we did not know we had. The loudness had given everyone permission to dismiss us without looking closely at the work. We were not going to do that again. The new charter provisions included one that I had proposed quietly in the middle of a long negotiation session about relay network rights, and which had passed with surprisingly little resistance, because by that point, most of the delegations were exhausted and ready to agree to things they might have argued about earlier. The provision required that any human-operated infrastructure serving Accord members had to be formally registered, acknowledged, and valued in the Accord's resource accounting. It sounds administrative. It is, in the most immediate sense, administrative. But what it actually does is make the invisible visible. It makes the quiet work audible. It puts a name on the things we build and maintains and says, this is here, it matters, and it belongs to someone who deserves recognition for it. Do good work and put your name on it. My grandfather would have approved. I stayed at the reception for another hour, then excused myself and walked back toward the Earth Embassy, which was open again, fully staffed with its lights on and its communications active, and the Earth flag mounted properly at the entrance for the first time in a year. My personal assistant, Lieutenant Yemi Okafor, was waiting at the entrance with a second cup of not-quite tea and a stack of messages. Anything urgent? I asked. 3 Accord member species have already submitted requests for bilateral infrastructure meetings, he said. The Orion Council wants to discuss the Eastern Relay. The Vilhari Foreign Office wants to talk about the atmospheric processing network. And the Karathi Commerce Bureau, not the political office, specifically the Commerce Bureau, has submitted a request for a private consultancy on deep space construction methodology. I took the cup of tea. Schedule them all. Start of next week. Also, he said, there is a message from Admiral Callum. I took the stack of messages from him and found it. It was short. Nora Callum writes the way she commands. Clearly, efficiently, without waste, it said. Good work. Fleet resumes standard patrol. Tomorrow. We'll be around at that. We will be around 4 words. But they carried everything in them. The quiet weight of a fleet that had gone dark and stayed dark for a year, that had held its position with discipline and patience, that had not once moved aggressively or made a single threat, that had simply waited because it trusted the larger plan even when it could not see all of it. We would be around. We would be in the relay networks and the agricultural stations and the hospital ships and the atmospheric processors and the construction yards. We would be at the diplomatic tables, loud and difficult and full of objections, because that is who we are and it is not a flaw. We would be in the veil, building things that no one had asked us to build yet, because someone was going to need them eventually, and we would rather have them ready. We would be around. In the months after the signing, I received many questions from journalists and researchers and younger diplomats trying to understand what had happened. They all wanted to know the same thing, framed in different ways. They wanted to know how we had won, what the strategy was, what the plan had been from the beginning. I always told them the same thing. There was no dramatic plan. There was no master strategy designed in a back room somewhere. What there was a very long accumulation of quiet decisions made by millions of people over many decades. Decisions to do the work, to do it well, to keep doing it even when no one was watching or counting or saying thank you. The walkout from the chamber had not been a calculated move designed to trigger a particular sequence of events. It had been something simpler. It had been the moment when I finally stopped pretending that the table we were sitting at was a fair table and decided that the most honest thing I could do was stand up. What came after that was not my doing. It was the doing of everyone who had been quietly building things in the veil for 91 years. It was the doing of every human engineer and doctor and farmer and Neshin who had taken a posting in the outer sectors and done their work without asking for recognition. It was the doing of Admiral Callum, who had taken orders she perhaps did not fully understand and executed them with complete precision. It was the doing of 41 million people living in systems that were not on any map. I had simply been the last one to speak before we went silent. On the day I left Veth Prime to return to the Vale for the first time since the signing, a young diplomatic attaché from a species called the Sarath, newly joined to the Accord, just completing their first decade of membership, stopped me at the transit terminal. She was small, covered in fine gray scales, with large amber eyes that gave her a look of permanent and earnest curiosity. She spoke carefully through her translator. Ambassador Ozzy, she said, my delegation has been asking questions about humanity. We are still learning. We are new here. She paused. Our senior diplomat told me to find someone who could tell me truthfully what humans are like, so I could understand what to expect. I looked at her. She was very young. She reminded me a little of myself at the beginning of all this. Curious, honest, trying to understand a galaxy that was much older and more complicated than any single species' experience of it. What did you hear? I asked. I heard many things, she said. Some said you are volatile. Some said you are unpredictable. Some said you are very loud. She paused again in the careful way of someone making sure they get the next part right. But the Velhari attaché told me something different, she said. Be careful. Not because humans are dangerous, but because humans will do things no one expects, and they will do them quietly. And by the time you realize what they have done, it will already be finished. I thought about that for a moment. That is a fair description, I said. It sounds like a warning, she said. It is, I agreed. But not the kind you think. I looked at her for a moment, this young person from a new species who was trying to understand something very old. It means that if you treat us honestly, you will have partners who will work harder than you expect, for longer than you expect, in places you did not think to look. It means that if you underestimate us, you will eventually find out what we were doing while you were looking elsewhere. She was quiet, thinking about it. And if we make the other kind of mistake, she said carefully, the kind the Accord made, I picked up my bag. The transit was boarding. Then one day, I said, you will look at an empty seat and understand what it means when we decide to stop explaining ourselves. I left her standing there in the terminal, thinking. The transit carried me away from Veth Prime, away from the orange sky and the copper-tasting air, through the long quiet between stars. I sat in my cabin and watched the darkness outside the window, and I thought about the next year and the one after that, and all the years of work that were still ahead. Not because we had won something, not because anyone had been taught a lesson, but because there was still so much left to build, and building is what we do, and we were finally, for the first time in a very long time, going to be doing it with our names on it. That, I thought, was enough to start with, and we started.